She thought it would be a simple dinner, just two people dressed nicely, walking into a restaurant on a quiet evening, hoping to enjoy a meal together. But from the moment they sat down, something felt wrong. Their menus never came. The waitress glanced their way, then looked past them as if they weren't even there. Minutes stretched into silence. Other tables were served, smiles, drinks, steaming plates, while theirs remained empty. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was the kind of quiet, cutting rejection that says, without words, you don't belong here. But what no one at that restaurant knew was who was sitting just a few feet away. At another table, watching everything unfold, was someone with the power to change more than just that evening. Someone whose reaction would send shockwaves far beyond the walls of that restaurant. What happens when silence turns into action and the person ignored becomes the center of a moment no one can ever forget? For Marcus and Aaliyah, Saturday nights were their escape. After a long week of work, it was the one night they promised each other they'd step away from the noise of everyday life. He was a young marketing manager, sharp with ideas and always under pressure at the office. She was a teacher, pouring her heart into her students, often staying late to grade papers that no one else would see. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and that was enough. Dinner outings were their little tradition. A new place each week, exploring the city through flavors and laughter. That evening, they picked a restaurant that friends had raved about. Bright lights, a polished atmosphere, the kind of spot where people came to feel special. They dressed up a little, eager for an easy night. To them, it was just dinner, nothing more. But the moment they stepped inside, there was a shift. Not loud, not obvious, just a subtle heaviness that neither wanted to acknowledge. Other couples were greeted warmly at the door, escorted with smiles to their tables. Marcus and Aaliyah waited a little longer, then longer still, before finally being led to a quiet corner at the back. They brushed it off. Maybe it was busy. Maybe the staff was distracted. They tried to push away the unease. As they sat, menus never arrived. Glasses of water never touched their table. Around them, conversations buzzed, plates clattered, and laughter floated in the air, yet they remained invisible. Each passing minute etched frustration deeper into Marcus's chest. Aaliyah kept glancing toward the staff, her hands folded tightly in her lap. It was subtle, quiet, the kind of treatment that could almost be explained away if you wanted to pretend it wasn't happening. But both of them knew better. This wasn't a mistake. It was the beginning of something that would test not just their patience, but the conscience of everyone watching. Because just a few feet away, another guest had noticed. Someone who was about to prove that silence can be broken, and when it is, the impact can be far louder than anyone expects. The first 10 minutes at that table felt like an eternity. Marcus kept adjusting his watch, trying not to show how uneasy he felt. Aaliyah shifted in her chair, her smile faint and nervous. At first they excused it. Maybe the waitress was busy. Maybe they had simply been overlooked. But as more tables filled and every one of those tables received menus, drinks, and warm greetings, the silence around them grew louder. They weren't just waiting for food anymore. They were waiting for acknowledgement, for the simple recognition that they existed in that space. Marcus noticed the waitress pass their table 3 times. Each time, her eyes flicked toward them, then away as though they were invisible. Plates of steaming pasta, sizzling steaks, and glasses of wine moved past their corner while their table remained empty. The air grew heavy, suffocating with the kind of tension you can't quite explain, but feel deep in your chest. Aaliyah leaned forward, whispering just above the hum of the restaurant. "Did you see that? She's pretending not to see us." Marcus nodded, jaw tight. He didn't want to make a scene, but inside, the frustration was climbing higher with each ignored moment. At another table nearby, a group of friends laughed as their server poured wine into crystal glasses. The contrast was glaring. Marcus and Aaliyah's corner felt colder, darker, like they had been deliberately set apart. It wasn't just neglect. It was deliberate dismissal. The minutes dragged on, and then something shifted. At the next table over, a man in a sharp suit looked up from his meal. He had noticed. His eyes followed the waitress as she breezed past Marcus and Aaliyah once again. His brow furrowed. He leaned back slightly in his chair, studying the scene, but Marcus didn't see him. He was too busy watching the clock tick, his patience running out. He debated whether to speak up, to call for a manager, to demand the same treatment as every other guest. Yet he hesitated, because he knew how it could look. An angry black man raising his voice in a public space. Too often he had seen that turned against people who looked like him. So he sat, silent but burning inside. Aaliyah's hand rested on his, steady but tense. They had learned to navigate moments like this with restraint. But restraint doesn't erase the pain. pain, it only buries it deeper. And then came the breaking point. Another couple walked in, a young pair, clearly unreserved. The hostess seated them just a few tables away. Within seconds, the waitress appeared, smiling, laughing, setting down menus, and offering drink specials. Not 5 minutes later, their glasses clinked with cold sodas, condensation dripping down the sides. Marcus exhaled sharply, his chest rising and falling with the weight of what they had just witnessed. It wasn't about being overlooked anymore. It was about being chosen to be ignored. The man in the suit at the next table shifted again, his attention locked on Marcus and Aaliyah's corner. He had seen enough, but still, he waited, studying, measuring the room. Marcus finally raised his hand, catching the waitress's eye. She paused, lips pursed, then walked over with an expression that was anything but welcoming. No greeting, no apology, just a clipped, "Yes?" The air froze. Marcus asked calmly for menus. She rolled her eyes slightly, as if the request itself was a burden. When she returned, she dropped the menus on the table without a word and walked away. The thud of the laminated pages hitting the wood was louder than any shout. Aaliyah's cheeks flushed. She looked down, blinking back tears. It wasn't just about food anymore. It was about dignity. And the man in the suit, his chair creaked as he pushed back slightly. He leaned forward now as if readying himself. Around them, the restaurant buzzed on, unaware of the storm brewing in that corner. To the other diners, it was just another night out. But to Marcus and Aaliyah, it was a battle, fought silently, painfully, against being erased in plain sight. Each second built on the last. Marcus's jaw clenched tighter. Aaliyah's hand stayed folded, knuckles pale. And that man in the suit, his gaze never wavered. The waitress returned again, this time delivering appetizers to another table. She passed Marcus and Aaliyah without a word, without a glance, as though they weren't even breathing the same air. The couple exchanged a look. It was the kind of look born from shared history, the kind that says, "Here we are again." But this time, they weren't alone. Because what no one realized, least of all the waitress, was that the quiet observer at the next table wasn't just anyone. He wasn't just another diner. He was someone with the kind of influence that could shift the balance of power in an instant. The question was, would he? The tension coiled tighter, waiting for release. And when it came, the entire restaurant would be forced to watch what happens when silence is broken and injustice is called out for what it truly is. The breaking point came faster than anyone expected. Marcus and Aaliyah sat stiff in their chairs, menus untouched, water still absent. The waitress walked past again, arms full of plates for another table, laughter spilling from her lips as though the couple in the corner didn't exist. Marcus's chest burned. His patience, his restraint, his silence, it had been tested to its limit. He opened his mouth, ready to stand, ready to confront the quiet cruelty head on. But before he could move, a chair scraped across the floor. The sound cut through the restaurant like a blade. Heads turned. Conversations slowed. The man in the suit, the one who had been watching, was now standing. His presence commanded attention instantly. Broad shoulders, sharp posture, eyes fixed not on his own meal, but on Marcus and Aaliyah's table. The room shifted. A hush swept across the chatter. The waitress froze mid-step, the tray in her hands trembling ever so slightly. Then he spoke, not with anger, but with a calm authority that made every word land heavier than a shout. He asked why the couple had been ignored, why every other table had been cared for, while theirs sat abandoned. His voice carried, echoing through the silence. The manager appeared, flustered, stammering excuses. But the man didn't let it slide. He revealed who he was, the CEO of the very company that owned this restaurant chain. Gasps rippled across the room. The staff's faces drained of color. Suddenly, the power dynamic had shifted. The couple who had been invisible were now at the center of every eye in the restaurant. Marcus's hands shook slightly beneath the table. Aaliyah blinked back tears, not of humiliation now, but of release, of being seen. For the first time that evening, the weight of silence wasn't theirs to carry alone. The CEO's voice grew sharper, cutting through excuses like glass. He said the truth aloud, the word everyone had avoided, the reason everyone had pretended not to notice: racism. He named it, raw and undeniable. In that moment, there was no hiding, no brushing it away. Every diner, every staff member, every person in that restaurant was forced to confront what had been happening in plain sight. The waitress lowered her tray, her face pale. The manager's words tumbled uselessly. The room was still, charged with the weight of a truth no one could escape. For Marcus and Aaliyah, time seemed to pause. The shame of being ignored, the ache of being dismissed, the quiet suffering, it was all laid bare under the spotlight of this man's voice. And yet it wasn't over. Because the question remained, would this moment end with hollow apologies, or would it spark something bigger, something that reached beyond this single restaurant, beyond this this one night. The room held its breath, waiting for what would come next. The silence after the CEO spoke was unlike anything Marcus or Aaliyah had ever experienced. The clinking of silverware had stopped. The hum of conversation was gone. Every pair of eyes in that room was now fixed on them, not in the way they had been ignored before, but in recognition, in uncomfortable awareness. For a moment, it was as if the entire restaurant had been forced to confront the very thing it had pretended not to see. The manager stumbled over an apology, words spilling out in a rush, trying to cover the wound with quick excuses. The waitress stood frozen, her face pale, her body stiff with the realization of what she had done. And Marcus and Aaliyah? They sat quietly, stunned by the sudden shift in power. Just minutes earlier, they had been invisible. Now they were at the center of attention. But the attention wasn't soothing. It was heavy. It carried the weight of a truth that should never have needed someone powerful to expose. The CEO didn't let the moment fade into empty promises. He demanded accountability, not just for that night, but for the culture that allowed such a thing to happen in the first place. He made it clear that silence was no longer an option, not for the staff, not for the management, not for the people who had sat watching it happen. And in that declaration, Marcus and Aaliyah felt something stir inside, a mixture of relief and grief. Relief that someone had finally said aloud what they had endured in silence. Grief that it had taken someone with status, someone with influence, for their pain to matter in the eyes of others. The manager offered a meal on the house, desperate to patch over the shame unraveling in public. But Marcus and Aaliyah didn't want free food. They wanted dignity. They wanted respect. They wanted to be seen and treated as equals, not as a burden, not as outsiders in a place meant for everyone. That was something no discount could buy. As they stood to leave, the weight of every gaze followed them. Some faces looked down, ashamed. Others looked uneasy, unsure of what to say or do. And somewhere among those expressions, Marcus and Aaliyah saw what they had always known. Some people would forget this moment by mourning, brushing it off as uncomfortable but insignificant. Others might carry it a little longer, letting it gnaw at them, letting it shift the way they noticed the world. For Marcus and Aaliyah, though, the night would never be forgotten. It would live with them, not as another dinner gone wrong, but as proof of how fragile belonging could be, how quickly joy could be stolen by prejudice. And yet there was something more. Because this moment, raw and exposed, had forced an entire room to witness what so many try to deny. It had shown how racism often doesn't come with shouts or slurs, but with silence, with neglect, with the choice to treat some as less deserving of even the simplest kindness. It had shown how easy it is for people to look away until someone makes it impossible to ignore. Marcus and Aaliyah walked out that night carrying more than just their own pain. They carried a story that spoke to millions, a story about being overlooked, dismissed, treated as invisible, not because of who they were, but because of the color of their skin. And while one CEO had the courage to speak up in that moment, the truth remained. Change cannot depend on a single voice. It has to come from all of us, because every ignored moment, every silent dismissal, every time someone chooses not to act, the wound deepens. And yet, every time someone stands up, every time someone refuses to be silent, the tide shifts, even if only slightly. The question is, how many more Marcus and Aaliyahs will it take? How many more quiet corners? How many more ignored tables? How many more nights of dignity denied before we finally decide that enough is enough? Their story is not just theirs. It is a mirror held up to all of us. And the reflection it shows is uncomfortable, undeniable, and demanding of action. So when you hear their story, when you feel their silence, when you see their pain, don't just watch. Don't just listen. Ask yourself, the next time you witness injustice, will you look away? Or will you stand like that man in the suit and remind the world that silence is no longer an option? Because in the end, the most dangerous seat in that restaurant wasn't the corner table where Marcus and Aaliyah sat. It was every other seat that stayed silent.